Good morning. It's good to see you today. We are continuing our study of the book of Revelation, and we are in chapter 4. This quarter, we're looking at the same study content from Sundays and Wednesdays. And so it's going to be 13 weeks of really looking at the book of Revelation. There are 22 chapters in the book and approximately 25 sessions. So we're looking at about one chapter per week. There may be some time where we, pause and get a little more detail in some of that. So the idea, why is that doing that? Haven't really touched anything, but we'll see if we can go back. Anyway, it's sort of an intense study during the last quarter, 3 months, and so I encourage you to log in to the Citrus Park channel on YouTube as we have our Wednesday evenings there. Most of the lessons that I will do will be voiceover on PowerPoints that I will post at that time, maybe a few hours ahead of time. There may be a couple of times where we do live stream where I'm just actually live and doing that. In either format, we're not set up for interactions with questions and answers, and so we're wanting to do that more on Sunday morning. So I encourage you when you're studying on Wednesday evening or when you're studying on your own to, there we go again. I guess someone really wants this slide to be presented, and we'll look at that soon enough. In any case, my point is that if you're studying, and I hope that you're looking at things carefully and trying to get the most out of this study, that you want to bring questions and so forth to the class here. And since this is live streamed and we're sending this out to other people, I will repeat questions so that they're recorded and easier to hear, and then we can proceed with those as well. The book is a challenge. The book of Revelation is probably the most controversial book in the Bible, and there's a lot of different systems of interpretation which we have explored and just recently looked at just a few of the main lines of interpretation. Within I'm just going to leave it there. I give up. We're going to look at apocalyptic in just a minute. But within the brethren that we are associated with among churches of Christ, there have been two main focal points on a preterist interpretation. And even the preterist interpretation is not the only one. If you look at Homer Haley's commentary, for example, he calls it historical background. He calls it an idealist approach. There are some ideas. I think that's important for us to think about. There are some timeless ideas in the book of Revelation. There are focal point ideas and lessons and propositions that are important for us to think about that would fit Christians living in any generation, whether you're living in Asia Minor in the 1st century, or whether you're living in Jerusalem in the 1st century, or whether you're living in Florida in the 21st century. There's something about this book that brings value to our lives today. And so we're going to emphasize that, even though there are some very interesting details to look at when we look at, for example, the dating of the book or certain passages in the Old Testament that are alluded to. We're going to look at some of those today as well. The book of Revelation is called the Apocalypse. That's the first word, apocalypsis, in the Greek language. And the reason that it's called that is because it is filled with symbolic language. And as you can see from this particular slide, I mentioned that this particular book is focused on things that have to do with symbols. And so there's a lot of symbolic language. There's a discussion about heaven and earth, people living on the earth dwellers, God and his throne in heaven. Chapter 4 is going to have some wonderful imagery from the throne room of God. And I'll have some analogies and comparisons that might help us get a little handle on why that is described that way. And so there's a lot of information available for you to do personal extra study. This obviously is a website that you can access easily from any search engine and access certain information. There are some websites better than others. And I've mentioned at the first lesson some of those that would be most valuable for you. But there are always others that are coming up. And as I say, this particular book has produced a lot of information from people because it's so interesting. If you take a futurist perspective, there are people that are saying, well, most of the things in the book are still future. And I don't really take that view. I take a preterist view where most of the things in the book are already accomplished. They're already in the past. And the two most positive interpretations or common interpretations of being fulfilled in the past is that it's referring to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And there are those that take a very strict approach that everything in the book, like chapters 1 through 22, everything fulfilled in AD 70. That has problems when you look at the last two chapters. That has real difficulties. And also dealing with other passages like Mark 13 or Matthew 24. The other view is that it's referring to the Babylon referring to Rome rather than Jerusalem. And so I'll just look briefly with you at a couple of things along that nature. As I mentioned, these are the main four interpretations. The fifth one that I put on the bottom is what I call a mixed view. And in reality, that seems to be what happens in practice, that a commentator is taking a strictly futurist perspective, and then they mix in some other stuff. So it's not totally future, it's mixed. And then we can take someone like Homer Haley that takes a basic preterist view and then also picks in some idealist ideas. So it ends up being a mixed view. And so if you look at most books and commentaries and scholarly discussions and put them into categories, if you had like 4 tables in your office or library and you wanted to put books into different categories, you're going to find a lot in the historicist view, a lot in the futurist view. That's going to be the biggest pile. And then there's going to be some in the preterist view. That's going to be a smaller pile. And then an idealist view, which is also a small pile. The biggest pile is going to be futurist, which is why you have a lot of even novels and things today talking about the future and going to the book of Revelation as speculating about the future. No doubt. In recent times there was the year 2000, Y2K, people saying the book of Revelation is going to be fulfilled in that period. And then there's other types of specific dates that people have made over the years to suggest that's going to be the end of the world. And every time people make these predictions, they end up failing. And what is so amazing is that they're still writing books and updates. One example would be Tim LaHaye, who wrote many years ago in the 1970s, The Late Great Planet Earth, stating that the time of the end was going to come very soon, no later than the year 2000. And even now, we're 20 years, almost 21 years after that, he's still writing books and people are still buying them, even though it did not take place, as he said. And the Bible talks about people who make prophecies and they don't come to pass. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on the dating of the book. I know that some of you are very interested in this, and as I mentioned in my 1994 lecture when I was invited by Florida College to present a lecture on chapter 14, I began that discussion with the point about the dating. From our perspective, from the perspective of people living in the time in which we find ourselves, it's not really relevant whether it was written before the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 69 or written after in AD 96. The message for us would be the same, that the themes, the messages, the encouragements, the admonitions to be faithful until death, this type of thing would still be true either way. The discussion becomes technical as to what makes the most sense when we are reading the book and thinking about the very first readers. The very first readers were, of course, the people living in Asia Minor, in these 7 churches. And we just finished looking in chapters 2 and 3 at the discussion about each of those churches. And so the question might be, if you were there living in that time, in the first century, in the late first century, whether it's the late 60s or the late 90s, and you're getting this information and someone is circulating a letter written by someone named John who says he's exiled just off the coast here on the Isle of Patmos, and you're reading that, how is it going to read to you? If the material is referring to the destruction of Jerusalem in Israel, how is that going to value or benefit you if you're living here in this geographical location here? Ephesus, Smyrna, Thyatira, Pergamon, or Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea. These are the people that the letter was addressed to. They were facing persecution from the Roman Empire, as we read in the book. And if the book is referring to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 69, the question that comes to my mind is, how is that going to be of value to these people? And so that's a weakness of that particular approach. That approach has some strengths as well, in that there is a temple mentioned in chapter 11 as if it were still standing, but it's a symbolic book, so it's not necessarily the same temple. In the last 8 chapters of Ezekiel, there's a temple described that never existed, but it's still described there. And so reason is because it's symbolic. So whatever position makes the most sense to you, my suggestion is go ahead and go with that. Take your little notebook. I've got my little notebook here. I've got my little notebook. As I read, I'll just jot down notes. As someone sends me emails or I read more things in my office, I'll write down more notes. And it's just kind of an ongoing process. And then after all that is done, there it went again. I didn't even say that. So I think God is telling me, let's move on. So we can keep moving on here. My point is that we want to make this a personal, valuable study. So take your notes. Just as I was mentioning a couple of times, I guess when I was talking about my dad, that he would be taking a notebook like this, writing things down and reading his Bible, and he didn't want anybody to know that he was doing that. And so when Sandy passed by the kitchen on her way to the bathroom, my dad didn't want anyone to know that he was interested in this stuff. And so he had covered everything up with the newspaper and was continuing to drink his coffee. But he still had his notebook and all of his notes on baptism and things like that. And so he was doing what he needed to do, and we need to continue to do that. We need to continue to grow in God's grace and knowledge. We're never finished. I don't know how many times I've read through the Bible. It's been a lot. But I learn something every time I read again and again, because it's living and active and powerful, more powerful than a two-edged sword. So now let's get to the slide. We're in chapter 4 here, and in chapter 4 we have the famous throne scene of God. And there are many passages in the Bible, well, I should say a handful of them. There are a handful of passages that give us the glimpse of heaven from the perspective of some prophet who's having a vision. This is the vision that John had while he was on the island of Patmos, and we're going to look at just 2 others as well. There, as I said, maybe a half dozen altogether that have some little glimpses into heaven. 2 of them in Ezekiel, 1 in Isaiah, and the book of Revelation itself. And let's just take a look at this passage in chapter 4. After this I looked, and lo, in heaven an open door. And the first voice which I had heard speaking to me like a trumpet said, "Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this." At once I was in the Spirit. And lo, a throne stood in heaven, and with one seated on the throne. And he who sat there appeared like jasper and carnelian, and round the throne was a rainbow that looked like an emerald. And round the throne there were 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones were 24 elders, clad in white garments, with golden crowns on their heads. From the throne issues flashes of lightning, and voices and peals of thunder. And before the throne burned 7 torches of fire, which are the 7 spirits of God. And before the throne there is, as it were, a sea of glass, like crystal. Isn't that awesome? We are propelled up to heaven through John's vision. He's there in the Spirit. It's a spiritual place. Of course, God is Spirit, and they that worship Him must worship in spirit and truth. It's not a material, physical, geographical place. It's spiritual. So, any terms that are used to describe it are obviously symbolic. But the language here is obviously symbolic with the use of words like or as. When we study literature in school, we find that there are terms that are used like similes, as, or there. There are metaphors that are used that don't use any signaling. It just states it, and you have to kind of figure it out that it's metaphorical, that it's not literal. And so, one of the things that we need to realize when we study a book that is an apocalyptic book is that we have to kind of reverse our interpretive process. The interpretive process, when we read a typical narrative, let's just say the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis. You read chapters 37 through 50 in Genesis, and it's strict narrative. It's narrative prose. It's like, I don't want to use the example of a newspaper. We don't use those very much anymore, and I don't even want to use the example of just journalism because that's changed too. So I'm just going to use an example of literature. Stories that we tell. Hansel and Gretel or something. And we read about that, and we're looking at the material, and we interpret it literally because it's just talking about this happened first. Once upon a time, there were 2 little children that lived in the forest, and so forth. And so, okay, that's interesting. And we interpret it literally, unless we have reason to think of it differently. When we come to a book like the book of Revelation, which is an apocalyptic book or a highly prophetic, symbolic book, then the mechanism that we normally deal with has to change. And we have to think, well, this is not normally literal, but it's normally symbolic. And so what we have to do is think of it as symbolic first, and then come around to think, well, maybe there'll be some little bits and pieces that are literal in the middle of the symbolism. And that happens. But the majority of the language is symbolic, and a minority of the language is literal. That's the exact opposite of the way we normally read narrative prose. As I said a moment ago, when we look at narrative, we look at everything literally, unless there are some specific isolated cases of symbolism, which that happens, of course. This particular vision is awesome. It's that the language is used to make us be totally impressed. And so if you were in a place like this where there was somebody that was sitting on a throne that appeared like jasper and carnelian, these are, bright stone jewels, and that's going to be very impressive to you. Even in typical history, we find that royalty likes to be dressed up with jewelry and fancy stones and crowns and maybe scepters that have a big ruby on top or something. Something that's very much reserved for the regal nature of this person, this singular king. And so that's the imagery we have here. I'm in heaven, and John says, and I saw this throne, and this is awesome. And not only that, but around that throne were there 24 more thrones, a little bit smaller, and there were 24 elders. So there's a lot of discussion about who the 24 elders are. The text here doesn't really focus on the 24 elders. The text focuses on the one who's sitting on the throne in the middle. Nevertheless, because we're curious, we want to think about who these 24 elders might be. And the most common well, I'll just leave it up to you. What do you think the 24 elders might be? I want to get some discussion here. Who could it be? Half of them could be apostles, okay? So that would be like 12, right? So is that the number of the apostles in the New Testament? 12, okay? So we have 12 apostles. I understand about Judas and then the Matthias taking his place and so forth. But you have 12 apostles, okay? And so that's 12. What about the other 12? The tribes of Israel. Okay, so there were 12 tribes of Israel. So you have the 12 sons of Jacob, Reuben and Judah and Simeon and all the rest, all the way down to Joseph and Benjamin, right? And so that's certainly a possibility. We're never told. We have to guess. That's a good guess. Do we have to know exactly who they are, or is the picture pretty awesome anyway? Now, because I asked the question that way, I think I kind of led the answer. Yes, it's awesome anyway. That's right. And I'm not trying to say that it's not important to try to figure out some of the details, but I do think that some of the details are there just for picture benefit, okay? That this book is to give you an impressive reaction. It's impressionistic in that way. Just like if we study art history and there is Impressionism, and we go to one of the famous museums of the world, let's just say the Prado in Madrid or the Louvre in Paris, and you see this, you walk into a gallery and there's this huge wall and there's a huge painting, and what you want to do is to kind of step back and look at the whole thing. It would be not very productive or valuable or impressive to put your nose 2 inches away from the canvas, which of course they won't allow you to do. But if you were able to, you might see the little brush stroke of red or green or brown, but you wouldn't know what it meant until you stood back and looked at the whole painting. That's what the book of Revelation is encouraging its readers to do, is to stand back and look at the impressive overview. I want to spend a couple of minutes just looking at two other throne room scenes in the Bible that are impressive as well. And one is found in Isaiah chapter 6. So we're going to look at just a few verses in Isaiah 6, and then we're going to look at the first chapter of Ezekiel. So if you have your Bibles open, I just want to read a few verses here. And I want you to think about Isaiah writing in the 8th century BC, and now he's living in a time of the Assyrian crisis, and he's writing to the people of God that have seemed to forgot to be faithful to him. And this is an impressive vision to Isaiah the prophet. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on the throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, and with the other 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, and the whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, I am undone, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the middle of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. You know, this imagery is impressing Isaiah to the point where after he sees it, he thinks he's going to die, because he knows that no one can see God and live. You can't survive that event. That experience is too awesome. And so he's at this point of just, losing it. And then one of the seraphim flew to him, having in his hand a burning coal, which he had taken with tongs from the altar, and he touched my mouth, and he said, Behold, this has touched your lips, and your guilt is taken away, and your sin forgiven. And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send? Who will go for us? Now, let me just pause here and say, first of all, Isaiah sees this awesome image, and he's just floored by it. Literally, like he can't even think he's going to survive it. He says, Woe is me, I'm undone. I'm here in the presence of God himself. How can this be? And as if to anticipate that feeling, the angel comes with a coal of fire to take away Isaiah's sins. Because you see, if you happen to be in the presence of God, you have to be totally holy, totally clean. It may not be your own actions. In fact, it won't be your own actions to make yourself clean. God will provide a way to make you clean, but you must become clean before you can be in the presence of God. And so that is another theme that's rolling through this, that we are, in fact, undone unless we have our sins forgiven, and then we can be in the presence of God. And almost as if God is not paying attention to the presence of his servant Isaiah, he speaks to his council in heaven, and the conversation is, we need somebody to go. Who's going to go for us? We've got the message that needs to be, who's going to go? And of course, there's Isaiah, and he's listening, and he's in the room, and he has the conviction to say, I'll do it. Here am I. Send me. And so God says, go and say to this people, hear and hear, but don't understand. See and see, but don't perceive. Make the heart of this people fat and their ears heavy, and shut their eyes, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and turn and be healed. God is fed up with his northern Israel people, and he's ready to punish them. And he tells Isaiah the prophet to go and speak to the people, but in a way where they're not going to respond because I'm fed up with them. I'm ready to punish them. And then Isaiah continues, well, how long should I do that? And God said, until the cities lie waste, without inhabitant, and houses without men, until the land is totally desolate. That's how long. So the message is a message of doom. It's a message of judgment. And the book of Revelation also is a message of doom and a message of judgment to those who are the earth dwellers, to those who are determined to have their focus on earth rather than on heavenly things. In the prophecy of Ezekiel, and we're going to look briefly in chapter 1, we are privileged to read about the experience of another prophet that is carried into the throne room of God. The book begins in the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the exiles by the river Kibar, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. You see some of the similarities between the book of Revelation, where John is saying heaven, the door of heaven was opened. The access to this throne room, this strategy room where God is with his host, is opened to a prophet. Isaiah in one case, Ezekiel in the other, and John on the Isle of Patmos. On the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the river Kibar, and the hand of the Lord was upon him there. And as I looked, behold, a stormy wind came out of the north, and a great cloud with brightness round about it, and fire flashing forth continually in the midst of the fire. And as it were gleaming bronze, and from the midst of it came the likeness of 4 living creatures. And this was their appearance. They had the form of men, but each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the sole of a calf's foot. And they sparkled like burnished bronze. And under their wings and on their 4 sides they had human hands. And the 4 had their faces and their wings like this. Their wings touched one another, and they went each one straight forward without turning as they went. And as for the likeness of their faces, each had the face of a man in front, and the 4 had the face of a lion on the right side, and the 4 had the face of an ox on the left side, and the 4 had the face of an eagle on the back. Such were their faces. Let me just pause here and say, that is an awesome vision. And artists have tried to depict what that might look like, but no matter how the painting or drawing might be, it's going to be somewhat less than this magnificent vision that Ezekiel saw. So you put all of these things together, and when you come to the throne room of God, there's flashes of lightning. There's brightness. Sometimes there's smoke. There's jewelry, and it's awesome, and it makes you want to fall down on your face in humility. And that's the imagery that we have here. Another thing that I want for us to think about here, just like in the prophecy of Isaiah, God is in this throne room with his host, the host of heaven. Just like when you read, every time there's a plurality of things mentioned about the triune God or the Elohim in the Old Testament, let us make man in our image. It's like there's a conversation going on among a plurality of participants. in chapter 11 of Genesis, let us go down and see what they're up to. And of course, it wasn't good. They were up to building a tower that would reach into the heavens. Their arrogance was they were going to try to reach up into the heavens, and God says, well, we're going to go down and we're going to confuse their language. Who's the we? Who's the Where's the strategy session taking place? Now, here, in the case of Isaiah, God is up there, and the conversation is, we need a messenger to send. Who shall we get? Who can we appoint for this job? And of course, it's dramatic effect because God knows who's going to be proposed. But Isaiah is listening, and he's hearing, and he volunteers. It shows his personal will involved, and that he wants to participate, and he wants to go and do God's bidding. And he says, well, I'm here. Why can't I be the one to go? Send me. And God says, that's a good idea. I'm going to send you, and I want you to do this. And then Isaiah says, how long? And he says, well, until everything is totally desolate. You're going to do that. Now, there have been times in human history and in recent centuries that we wonder what it would be like to be in a strategy room where great decisions are made. Where if you put yourself in the land of Britain in the time of the Second World War, and there are bombs dropping overhead, and Hitler is on the rise, and Nazism is making its paces throughout Europe, there is a strategy room, and there are people that are gathered around, and they've got little they've got maps either on a table. Sometimes there's a table there with maps, and they put little pieces that are supposed to be platoons and armies and submarines and ships and different things. And it helps them kind of get a visualization of the geography and the plan of attack and what they're going to do. And so you have examples of this in history with the Second World War. In that same period of time in the United States, we had our own strategy room with maps on the walls and European theater and what's going to take place and who. So what we see in these throne room visions, what John is seeing in the book of Revelation is like a huge vision of the strategy of the pending battle that is going to take place. In fact, in chapter 12, the vision's going to say, and there was war in heaven. This is a heavenly battle. Another way of saying this is that there was war in the spiritual realm. And Michael and his angels were fighting, and so we're going to get to that soon enough. But my point is that to have in your mind this idea of being transposed into a strategy room where great military decisions of battle are being made is what we are seeing here in the spiritual realm of the book of Revelation. I'll mention another passage in my sermon next hour that corresponds to that idea as well. So if we continue reading in this passage, this throne room, we're still in this throne room. Keep in mind what happened when Isaiah was up there looking at the things of God. And if we look here at verse 7, I'll look at the first part of middle of verse 6. And round the throne, on each side of the throne, 4 living creatures. This is kind of like a composite of what Ezekiel saw and what Isaiah saw put together. The language that John uses to write his book is taking imagery from a resource of the Old Testament prophets. And around the throne, on each side of the throne, are 4 living creatures with full of eyes in front and behind. And the first living creature was like a lion. The second living creature was like an ox. The third living creature was like the face of a man. And the fourth living creature like a flying eagle. Doesn't that not sound just like what we were reading in Ezekiel? That's where the language is. And the reason is that this is to impose awesome impression upon us. When we think about an ox, Will you tell me? When you think about an ox, what do you think about? What's characteristic of that animal? Strong, like carrying a plow and so. What about a lion? That's another animal mentioned here. A lion. What's characteristic about a lion? Fierce, king of the forest. You know, it doesn't. What if it was like a squirrel and an ant? Or I mean, those kinds of creatures aren't mentioned because they don't make the impression. Think about this. When you think of a lion as opposed to a lamb, a lamb is very docile, very weak, very obedient, whatever you want. You want to, put a knife to my neck, I'm here, just go for it. I mean, the sheep isn't going to fight at all. Which, of course, is the image used for Jesus. He's a sheep. But he's also a lion. So John mixes his metaphors, which tells us that the point of the metaphor is to give an impression. It's not to be detailed on every little focal point of what we see. It's like the brush strokes on an impressionistic painting. Some of the detailed strokes, you can analyze it, but what you have to do is stand back and look at the whole picture. And maybe that's the idea. The idea is the whole image, not those specific tiny little details. And when commentators and people have been very focused on details and tried to make historical comparisons like this is fulfilled in that, this is fulfilled secondly here, so they have failed miserably. The book of Revelation is deliberately ambiguous. It's supposed to be vague. It's not supposed to be crystal clear. It's apocalyptic. That's the kind of language it is. Now, people like us who are careful students of the Bible kind of go against that. We want the details, and we want to be very precise in every little point. And this book really resists that. So I'm just saying, you need to think about that as we read, and maybe the point is the overall picture and not just those details. Notice that in Isaiah's account, there was this description of holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. And that's what you see here as well. The one who is and who was and is to come. The eternal nature of the Godhead. And whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to him who is seated on the throne, who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him who is seated on the throne, and they worship him who lives forever and ever. And they cast their crowns before the throne, saying, Worthy art thou, Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you did create all things, and by thy will they existed and were created. The force of Revelation 4 is to put us in God's throne room and to force us to fall down like Isaiah and say, Woe is me! I am undone. How can I possibly exist in this place? And of course, the answer is, well, you can't unless you're made holy. And if you're made holy, then you're able to be there. Just like Isaiah had this burning coal that came, and he says, I don't belong here. I'm a man of unclean lips. I live among a people of unclean lips. And before he could almost get those words out, the angel came with the coal and touched his lips and says, Now you're purified. You're clean. It's okay. You can relax now. You can be here. And right when that takes place, he overhears the conversation. Who's going to go for us? Who shall we send? And Isaiah says, Here am I. Send me. It's an awesome vision. And there's a lot we could say about the even just the description of heaven itself. In the book of Revelation, and I want to just point out that there are different symbols. This is more like a strategy room, a throne room where big decisions are made and delegates are appointed, emissaries are appointed to do someone's bidding. This was the case of Isaiah. In the case of John, he's told to send this message, to write things down, to not write things down, to get the message out. He's the emissary. He's the messenger. And so Revelation 4 gives us this throne room scene. It's also described as a place where military decisions are made. In this case, it's a heavenly battle, a spiritual battle, not a geographical one, but it has implications on the geography, as we will see. It has implications on earth. In chapter 5, the imagery of heaven is a place where a synagogue is read, because John is going to open a scroll, which is what typically takes place in a synagogue. You get a scroll, you open it up, and you read it, just like we see Jesus doing when he was at Nazareth. In chapter 8, heaven is described as a place like a temple where a sacrifice is made, or an altar where a sacrifice is made. And so that's an imagery of heaven. If we go to chapter 12, the discussion describes heaven as a courtroom where there is a plaintiff and there are charges made and there is someone that is punished or judged, sentenced. So the imagery of heaven is different in each of these places because the point is different in each of those chapters or each of those sections of the book. And so the imagery, the book of Revelation is filled with imagery and symbols. Those symbols are changed, transformed. Some of them are taken directly from the Old Testament and given new meaning here. The idea of coming on the clouds is also another imagery that's found in the Bible. Several different places to refer to several different judgments. Isaiah 19, God is coming on the clouds. In that place, it was against the country of Egypt. Have we had the second bell? Not yet? Okay. And then Jeremiah chapter 4, God comes on the clouds. It's against Judah when they go into Babylonian captivity. In Matthew 24, coming on the clouds, we have references to the destruction of Jerusalem, which did in fact take place. Here in the book of Revelation, we have other passages describing this imagery in chapters 1, 10, and 14. And it could be something totally different than one of those things that went before, because apocalyptic language uses and reuses symbols from other parts of history and gives it new meaning in John's vision. All right, next time, on Wednesday evening, we'll be looking at chapter 5, and the schedule at least is for next Sunday morning here to continue with chapter 6. So stay tuned and bring your questions and comments. Thank you so much.